My understanding is that some people have some confusions about the user authentication, and I want to try to alleviate some of that and help you out with a sort of a simplish model that I could come up with for user authentication and how it works. I'm going to start with show you the home page. So this is just localhost 8000. So this is the root folder. It welcomes you to the site. It allows you to log in, and we'll take a look at this form in a minute. And then I've just spit out all of the posts in order, reverse order of posting. And so there were a couple of posts that we had on screen a couple weeks ago, back in February, and then I've added some more posts recently about that. Let me show you a little bit. So if I log in, one of my users is TBS Dr. J, and he has a super secret password. And then when I log in, it shows the name of the user and then a logout button giving the person the option to log out. So if I used a different login, the same thing would happen. That's one of the students who's on the server. Let me show you how that works, why that works. So in the user authentication. So let's switch over to the code. So notice in the models, so I import just the basic models module from Django. I only have one model. I only have one object that I've created, which is just for posts. As post text, which is just the whatever the message is, length 280 because we're in Twitter. User, notice that this lines up with the username field, and I'm using the built-in user model, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And then I have a publication date, and I have a number of likes. I did a sort of a nice pretty print version of a string representation of this, but that's not really necessary, but that's nice. So when I switch over to the views, so you'll notice I have to import my own post object. I imported time zone so I could sort, and I'll use now function if we create a new post. But then I'm importing from the built-in models, I'm importing the user. And that simplifies some things. It works well with these functions of authenticate, login, and logout. So it certainly simplifies things to use the built-in user model. I also imported pretty print. That'll come up later when we look at the request object. This is the index view. That's the one we were just looking at. First part of this has to do with the top of the page. If you remember, we had either it showed a form that allowed you to log in, or it showed the name of the person who allowed you to log out. Because there's that log out button, that's actually also a separate form. It just has no visible fields. One of the things I want to highlight here is this if statement and the next if statement. So the first if statement is if request dot post. So if we have any website, if you just go to a website and there's no form that's been submitted, there's no action that's happening to get you to that website, then the default method for pulling that website is get. And so you'll see that if you look at the scrolling part of the run server command in your terminal, you'll see it. So let me show you that quick. Here you can see when I first went to the website without any submission, then it was a get. And then when I submitted something, it was a post instead. If there's post data, then you got to this website using a form. If there's get data, if it's only get, then all the information is encoded in the URL, and it's just the URL, and it's just going to get that page. When I look at this if statement, I've got if request.post because that tells me that a form has been submitted. So the next line here, this actually goes into the details of the form. So I'm going to go take a look at the actual HTML template before take a look at this if statement. So here's the HTML. It starts out in the header. I've just got a title, and I've got Bootstrap coming in. I've got a background color. I've got Bootstrap container, welcome header. And now here's where the piece of the page is, where it either welcomes a logged in user or it gives a person a chance to log in. So I'll take a look at the bottom half first. So if you're logged in, you'll go here. If you're not logged in, you'll go here. We'll talk about this logged in variable in a minute. I've got a form, and it allows you to input the username. And so I've got a label on it, which just says username. And then I've got the input box. The input box is a type text, and its name is input username. So this, when it comes back through in the post data, then input username is going to be the key, and the value of this field, whatever somebody types into this field, will be the value of that key in the dictionary. So again, request.post, all the post data is going to come across, well, it's JSON on the HTML side, it turns into a Python dictionary on the Python side. And these names, when you use name equals, those will be the keys in your Python dictionary or your JSON object. Either way, this is what it uses as the key. So ID is something that is generally used for JavaScript and HTML. And so I set this ID because in the label, this label is for a certain object, so it associates and Bootstrap likes this to associate a label with an input box. And so the for field in the label requires the ID here in order to match the two of those up. So this input username matches with the ID. This input username is key in the dictionary. So I can put in a username here. That's this div object. And then this div object is the password. It allows me to input a password. It'll come across in the dictionary as related to the key input password. And then I have a submit. Bootstrap likes buttons instead of input type submit. I'm not entirely sure why. And I put login on it. And so that's my form. You'll notice again, the method is post. You should use post for anything you don't want written out in full plain text in your URL. Obviously, passwords and usernames fall into that category. So if the post data is coming from this form, it'll have two fields, input username and input password. So if I come across here to the views, we can demonstrate that. So I'll do this here. We'll just print request.post, save that, and then we will go over to the browser. So it logged me in. So let's take a look at what happened in the terminal. So if you look, post data includes, and in fact, it's 3 fields. You'll notice that in the form, there was that CSRF token. Not a big deal. It's a way of preventing certain types of attacks on websites. Don't have to worry too much about that. Input username is TBS Dr. J. So this input username came from the name in the input object, and this came from the name in the other one, and it shows the password in full plain text for you to compare. If we have that input username in the keys, now this is a subtlety here. A lot of people have been having these errors that are like multiple keys in a dictionary or something like that, multi-key dictionary errors. I can show you why you get those errors. You notice on line 24 here, I just said if request post. So if there's any post data, then we'll go into this if that'll test as true. So it's tempting, and I certainly did this myself. If request post input username, and again, so I'm testing if this field exists, right? That throws this error because I'm trying to access a key in a dictionary that doesn't exist. So this key is, if this key is not in this dictionary, then it's going to throw that multi-key dictionary error, which is a little strange because it's actually not multiple, it's 0. The problem is the other direction. We have 0 keys of this name rather than multiple keys of this name. But this will throw that error. If you want to avoid that error, don't try to access the key until you know it exists. And so you can test if this string is in the list of keys. And that's the safest way to do this. And then you won't, if you do this bit before you attempt to access it here, then you won't run into those. If you ever played with pointers, it's the same thing of like, if this pointer is not null, then you look for it and see what the content is. And because otherwise you end up trying to reference null pointers and crashing your programs all the time. So same deal here. You want to test if the key is in the list of keys before you try to access it. Now here again, we're trying to simplify the user authentication piece. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the authenticate function. Again, I had to import that from the authorization model. Authenticate, log in, and log out of the 3 functions that I imported from the authentication module. I authenticate by sending across a username and a password. One thing to notice here that's not obvious, I certainly didn't find this obvious when I did it. Authenticate only checks if the username and password is correct. It does not actually log you in. If you want to log in, you have to do this bit. So it says if user is not none. If this username and password information is incorrect, then the authenticate will return none as its return. If the username and password information is correct, it will set it will return a user object and assign to this variable. So I have to test if user is not none. If it is not none, then I know that the username and password were correct for some user. If it is, and you can tell who it is if you'd like. But if it is none, then I know that that was an incorrect username and password. And I could probably put in some kind of else here for message for failed login. I didn't bother to do that. You can output some sort of message for a failed login if the user is in fact none, because that's what happened. So then you use the login function. You have to has two arguments: the request, which is this bit, that's just the full information of the HTTP request, and the user object that was returned by authenticate. And so then when you log in, this is a login that will persist. So you may have noticed when you use the admin interface, you log in as admin with a password. That's now a login that persists across sessions. So if you close the admin interface, open some other browser windows, and then reopen the admin interface, you're already logged in. And that's because this login function that I imported from the authorization module of Django is a persistent login. It uses a cookie, it saves that authentication, and leaves you logged in until you manually log out. Now notice that, so I'm throw some errors. If instead I've got the logout field in my keys, as if logout is one of the keys in the dictionary, then I am going to do the logout instead, and I just send it the request. It doesn't matter who the user is, it's just going to log out whoever's logged in. Now, after I've dealt with logging in and logging out, here I can test, is somebody still authenticated? Now, why do I have to do this? So it's really easy for me to tell if somebody's authenticated or not in Python, because I have this nice isAuthenticated function. However, or attribute of the user. However, I can't access this directly in the HTML template. And so I'm creating a Boolean flag, a very simple Boolean flag, logged in equals true, logged in equals false. There's a more Pythonic, faster way to do this in one line rather than this 4-line version, but this 4-line version is probably easier to read for most of us. So I stuck with that. Then I grabbed the template, and then I grabbed all the posts, and I wanted to sort them. I could have just used all, but I wanted to sort them, so I did in reverse order by publication date. And then here, if you remember, if I go back to the models, in my posts, the user information is only the username. This is an important idea in database storage. So I could have included the user first name and user last name, because that's the information I'm trying to add to it. I could have done that, but then you're storing the user's first name and last name both in the user object in the database, the user table, and also in the post object, the post table in the database. And that's a bad it's a bad way of handling databases. You don't want to store that same information in two places, because if I go then and get married and change my last name, and I change my name in my user object, I want that to propagate to all of my posts, so that now all of my posts have my new last name, for example. The easiest way to do that is you only store the user's first name and last name in one place, and any other time you need it, you look it up. And so that's what I'm doing here, is I'm looking up, I'm saying, okay, for each post, I'm going to look for that username, and then I assign the first name field to be the first name of the user and last name field to be the last name of the user. Now I emphasize something here. I used a different first name variable than here, because in the first name with the underscore, that's in the user object. So if you go back to the Django documentation, standard user object uses first underscore name. So I used first capital N name, so that it's a little clearer when I come across here to my template, then I can see which one am I using. I'm using the one that I created, that I assigned, which is the camel text version, because I don't have access to the first underscore name user object, because the user object isn't in the context. This is the user who's logged in. It's not necessarily the user on the post. And so I need to go through and I'm adding two fields to this post object. I'm manually adding a first name field and a last name field to each post, as if I had stored it in the database that way, without the disadvantage of storing it in the database that way. And so then when I access the post, I can find the first name and last name of the user. I've added those fields to that object temporarily, so that when I display it, it displays with the first name and the last name attached to each post. So this one was posted by this person, this one was posted by this person. So the last thing I want to go over here is the context. It's a dictionary on the Python side. It has keys as I assign them. So I did all posts, and this was a list, all posts that I made from the database. I fetched a bunch of stuff from the database, and then I parked it in the context so that I could send it to the template. Now, I added some information to that. You remember by looking up the usernames and adding the first name and last name of each of those usernames. Those are part of those post objects. So this is really a long list of post objects, each of which has its own dictionary of information about it: first name, last name, username, post text, and all that. Then logged in is another field in this dictionary, which becomes a field in the JSON, and it just has a single Boolean as its value. And we set that to match the is authenticated attribute of the user. And then this is the user who's logged in. This could be empty, it could be none, or it could be someone, and that's fine. We'll use that to determine whether we should put somebody in or not. So when I come across here to the template, I've sent that context over. All posts is a variable, it's a field in that JSON object over here. And so it can see that that's a list, it's iterable. And so we can do a for loop on it, and we'll assign post as the variable for each entry in that list. And then that post entry has its own fields: first name, last name, post text, pub date, and likes, and we use those to display the post on screen. So here it is on screen. Here's the first name, last name, here's the text, post text, here's the publication date, and here's the likes. So hopefully that gives you a bit better sense of the authentication piece, the authenticate, login, logout functions, and how you can use only those three functions in the standard user object in Django to manage a user authentication for your website. And then hopefully that also helps you track the variables and the scope of those variables, which variables live where, and how you can use them, and where you can use them and where you can't use them, because I think that's been a lot of the frustration and challenge that people have been having lately. So hopefully that will help you make more sense out of all those things. If you have more questions, you know how to find me, and we'll talk to you soon.